Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. New Zealand has faced plenty of extreme weather, notably floods and storms over the past couple of years. Again this week, heavy rains hitting parts of the country, down on the east coast around Gisborne in particular. Whilst the Auckland anniversary weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle around the Hawke's Bay have stolen the headlines with the biggest damage perhaps recorded in those regions, few parts of the country seem to have been spared. Obviously in the upper North Island, Northland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, other regions, Hawke's Bay, as previously noted, the east coast have been hit hard, but in the past couple of years also parts of the South Island, Nelson, Canterbury, Marlborough, Westport have also felt the wrath of Mother Nature. This has led to questions about where we live, work and play, and talk of managed retreat from some areas. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Martin Brook, Associate Professor of Applied Geology at the University of Auckland. Hi Martin, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast.
Hi Gareth, good to talk to you and thanks for inviting me on.
In the wake of various recent storms, we've been hearing criticism about where we've built in the past and how this has left us more exposed when extreme weather events have hit. As a geologist, you focus on the science that deals with the Earth's physical structure and substance, its history, and the processes that impact it. So if you were in charge of building, say, Auckland, which is obviously our biggest city, from scratch, knowing what we do know today, how and where would you build and what landscapes and areas would you want to avoid?
Gareth, it's an interesting question. And obviously the Unitary Plan, the Auckland Unitary Plan doesn't discuss any of that. We generally, if we were planning, we'd avoid slopes and floodplains. And obviously that includes a lot of Auckland. And in fact, a GNS report in 2009 stated that most of Auckland is at moderate or high risk of landslides, and that was in 2009. But it's very difficult because that encompasses a lot of the landscape of Auckland, and it would mean that we wouldn't build in a lot of Auckland. So it's a difficult problem that you've come up with. But yeah, certainly if you look at the Auckland Unitary Plan, it doesn't encompass the geomorphology, if you like, which is the landforms and the earth surface processes that are currently shaping our landscape.
And obviously other cities around the country are in earthquake zones. So I mean, obviously when European settlement came to New Zealand and our modern cities as we know them now started to get built, they were built where they are because of ports or rivers or whatever. They didn't think about geology, but we obviously know a lot more about that today. So I guess what do you think are the key lessons from the recent extreme weather events in this context?
I think the lessons are manifold. First of all, we are vulnerable to extreme weather events, and we have a general lack of resilience to extreme weather. And the climate scientists tell us that extreme weather events might be becoming more prevalent. Secondly, I think we build too close to slopes. We love doing that. We cut trees down. We love building mansions on slopes. So we have wonderful views. And we have a history in New Zealand of building on unstable land. And part of that is the 1981 Local Government Amendment Act, which absolved councils of civil liability if they permitted building on unstable land. So we've got a legacy issue there, and hence issues in Rodney District. And thirdly, moral hazard exists in New Zealand. We found that out, and that's where an economic actor will increase their exposure to a risk because they don't bear the full costs of the risk. So in New Zealand we have EQC Act, so we've got EQC cover up to $300,000. And so if we're a homeowner, we pay premiums to that, obviously, don't we? But I think they're the three things. We are vulnerable, we build too close to slopes, and moral hazard does exist in New Zealand.
It's interesting you mentioned the Local Government Act from 1981, and you also mentioned the Unitary Plan not really catering for some of these geology issues. Do you think that the powers that be need to maybe sit down and have a good long hard think about some of these laws and how perhaps we can change them in ways that discourage building in some of these areas that really we shouldn't be building in?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that is happening. I mean, Grant Robertson, he's sort of embracing that when he announced those initial risk categories and definitions, 1, 2C, 2P, 2A, and 3. So things are moving in that space. I think I'm not a political scientist, but I I'm a homeowner, and I think a lot of issues stem from our 3-year electoral cycle. We have very short time frames for things. Politicians don't like making very difficult decisions, and there is a disconnect, I think, between Wellington and a lot of the local authorities. But it looks like Grant Robertson is moving in the right direction, I would think.
It almost sounds really like these sorts of issues of this sort of magnitude, national magnitude, really need to be depoliticised. I mean, it would be great, wouldn't it, just to get everyone around a table together and say, right, this problem is caused by this and that, and we really need to, in the future, not build in these regions where we know they're highly likely to flood or there'll be major slips in heavy rain events, of which we are expecting to experience more frequently.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a difficult nettle for politicians to grasp, but it has happened before. I mean, the Christchurch earthquakes, 8,000 houses were red zoned, and householders were given two options, and so they could get full payment at the 2007 property valuation, or they could get payment for land, and the rest is paid by the insurance. Most, I think, took the second option. So politicians have dealt with these kind of things in the past, to do with earthquakes, and not really so much to do with floods and landslides. And landslides are an important hazard. They kill more people in New Zealand over the last 150 years than earthquakes. So it's important that people understand with the EQC Act, it's about all natural hazards. But yeah, these are difficult concepts for politicians to grasp, I think.
Yes, interesting. You mentioned that, I guess, managed retreat, we probably could call it in Christchurch, in the red zone post the earthquakes. Obviously, managed retreat is something we're hearing about a lot more now after the flooding and cyclones we've experienced of late. To what extent do you think we really need to embrace managed retreat, or, I guess, moving people, property and infrastructure away from areas at high risk?
I do, yeah, I think we should. And I mean, the Insurance Council of New Zealand flagged this in 2022. So before what has happened this year, they signalled that local governments have got to stop. I think their phrasing was stop people building in dumb places. ICNZ said. So that was in 2022 before what's happened this year. And obviously Grant Robertson now, he's come up with the initial risk categories and definitions, which is great. However, it looks like the funding model, is it going to be central government and local government, or what's the ratio going to be of financial contributions? That's yet to be worked out.
That's always a challenge. And I mean, a lot of the burden seems to fall on local government, but I mean, are they really set up to manage all of this?
I'd say, well, from understanding geological hazards and risk, I mean, there's pockets of excellence around the country. I mean, I won't name names, but a couple of unitary authorities in particular have got some excellent geologists working for them who really do understand the nature of geological hazards and risk. So that there's certainly ability within the country. But yeah, that's a difficult question, Gareth.
You have talked about, you've called for a National Geotechnical Control Office. Would that be a way of improving this?
I think so. So in Hong Kong, I mean, they had some terrible landslides in the early 70s. Events that might kill more than 100 people. Now they've got an Office of Geotechnical Control in the Hong Kong government that is on top of a lot of planning decisions, slope stabilization, and all the rest of it. That could be good if it was maybe situated within the EQC, because if it was a standalone government department, I think we're going to have silo issues again. And I think if a geotechnical control office could become a directorate within the EQC and make nationwide decisions and application of technologies and economies of scale and all the rest of it, I think that could be useful. So as it is, everything seems to be given to local authorities to do, and I'm not sure they have the capacity.
You've written some interesting articles over recent months, especially about slips and landslides, and obviously we've seen plenty of those. One of the things that you've noted, specifically about Auckland, but I'm sure it applies to other parts of New Zealand as well, is a lack of adequate building setback distances, which is the distance between a dwelling and a slope or a cliff edge. you wrote that a house on a 30-metre high North Shore cliff with superb views, of course, across to Rangitoto Island should be set back around 100 metres from the cliff edge. Now, obviously, there are lots of houses and businesses around on the North Shore and other parts of Auckland that are a lot closer to cliff edges than that. Should the setback rules be similar for all cliff edges? And what could be done to reduce risk in these areas where there are buildings that are just too close to those cliff edges?
Yeah, setback distances are important from the cliff edge, but also from the foot of the cliff. The Shore Road, the fatal Shore Road landslide earlier this year, that was a building at the foot of a cliff. So it's important that setback from the toe or the foot is included. Yeah, so some jurisdictions around the world have very rigid setback distances, almost too rigid, I would suspect. But in somewhere like Auckland, with our varied geology, it could be more nuanced. For example, a setback distance. There are a lot of site-specific effects due to very local structural geology reasons. I think a blanket setback distance across Auckland would be ridiculous and absurd. But one maybe based a bit more nuanced to do with the local geological processes and effects could be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about with that North Shore example, 100 metres. I mean, that's a long way. And if you went over to the North Shore and measured 100 metres back in some areas, you'd cover lots of houses and roads and who knows what else, probably schools and parks and other things. So it's probably not realistic that is going to happen in a place like that. But surely, I guess, we need to be planning for the future to do things better than we have to date.
Yeah, well, I mean, Auckland Council have signalled that. 100 metres does sound a lot, but the climate change polygons that they released, which I think went on their GIS maps the year before last. I mean, those lines are quite a way back from the cliff edges on the North Shore. I think Tonkin and Taylor did that for the council, and then it was all peer reviewed. Sure, 100 metres back seems ridiculous. But if you go to some places like Eastern Beach, on the same East Coast base formation as the North Shore, there's been substantial erosion, and landsliding going back tens of meters from the cliff edge, without a doubt. And that's over the last year or two.
Yeah, I recall the former mayor of Manukau, actually Barry Curtis, had a house there. We're talking here about Bucklands Beach in the eastern suburbs of Auckland. Actually, my in-laws lived not far from Barry Curtis's place there, and I remember walking past it, and it was pretty grim, and that's probably 10 years or so ago. So yeah, this is not a new issue. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and Gareth, along Bucklands, I mean, the problem there is the dip of the bedding in the soft rocks is out of the slope, so it's very unfavourable for cliff stability. So that's an example of very site-specific effects where a setback distance might need to be 100 metres, whereas other parts of Auckland where, say, the bedrock dips into the slope and the cliffs are therefore more stable. You could have a lower setback distance, for example. So you've highlighted a good example there.
You also suggested a sophisticated region-wide approach to identifying unstable land and saying that this is needed. And you wrote in I think this was the same article, about a project you were involved with in Gisborne in recent years. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why this is really needed?
Yeah, so Gisborne, we were funded by the EQC to undertake INSAR satellite monitoring in Gisborne, and it was in conjunction with Gisborne Council. They've got a very experienced, forward-thinking principal scientist who's probably one of New Zealand's foremost geologists as well. And so we were funded by the EQC to use INSAR, that's interferometric synthetic aperture radar, and that's space-borne radar pointed down at the ground. And these are European Space Agency satellites we used, and they have a 12-day revisit time. So every 12 days, you get sent more data. So you have to throw quite a few algorithms at the data. I hired a very smart Welsh guy to come over and do it. And we came up with slope deformation or slope velocity maps for the whole of Gisborne. So the council then know which slopes are moving faster than others, when they picked up speed and why. Did some people cut a load of trees down? Did they build a swimming pool on a slope? Is that why that's so? So the councils can make quite nuanced, focused decisions on planning, on future planning, and especially with regard to residential subdivision. I think that was Gisborne's main issue, especially in the Wheatstone Road area to the east of the city.
Okay. You've also written about warning alarms and maybe improving these. We have some of these already. I mean, I can think of examples, particularly tsunami warning alarms. But I mean, what in terms of, I guess, for landslides or slips or flooding, what do we do now, and how could we improve it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's spaceborne technology out there, like I just mentioned, but also there's ground-based monitoring systems like things called extensometers, tilt meters, piezometers, which measure the water in a slope, for example. And measuring the water in a slope is very important because as the water pressure rises within a slope, the pore water pressure, that weakens the soil material. So they're more prone to failure. So, measuring the water pressure the pore water pressure within a slope can often be a precursor to any slope movement. And look, these are all standard tools that are used. And, there's some great technology used above State Highway 1 after the Kaikoura earthquake. Sorry, after the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake, to monitor the slopes there while the roads and rail was being reinstated. So a lot of this technology exists in New Zealand. A lot of the skill to apply it and interpret it does exist. However, there is a note of caution, I guess, because there's one example from the UK, Parton landslide in Cumbria, which actually wasn't a landslide, but that was a town there evacuated in I think 2021 because some cracks opened up or were noted on the hillside above the town. So all sorts of monitoring equipment was put in. The town was evacuated for a couple of weeks. And then it was understood that after the monitoring, look, there's no slope movement at all. The cracks are just because the soil has been drying out. And so, everybody could go back to the town then. So there's good examples of the use of monitoring equipment around the world and in New Zealand.
Is it just maybe something we need to do more of?
I think so, yeah. And it requires investment, but I mean, it should be targeted for particular places. Murawai, Karakari, Piha, places like that, which we now know are particularly vulnerable to landslides. So monitoring equipment could be put into particular slopes, above and around those townships.
Focusing a bit more on flooding, Auckland Council's come out with this Making Space for Water initiative. What do you make of that?
So that's, I mean, flooding per se isn't my thing, but I know that's that 9-point initiative. I think it's a good idea, but obviously it's focused on floods only. And when you get a storm, floods and landslides are two sides of the same coin. So, while that's a great initiative, it includes technology, planning, all the rest of it. It obviously excludes landslides.
Yeah, so you'd like to see, I guess, a more coordinated approach, bringing in all the different things that can happen when a storm hits.
Yeah, exactly. A more holistic storm-based approach. Yep.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Obviously, insurance is a key factor in here, and there's obviously concern about uninsurable places emerging, with private insurers getting nervous when the same areas keep getting hit by storms. And obviously the cost of insurance is rising a lot as well. So you've suggested that New Zealand could become uninsurable, and you've actually gone as far as suggesting that becoming a state of Australia would be a way to get around this issue and give better economies of scale. Are you serious about becoming a state of Australia? And I mean, obviously you would come into contact with insurers, I imagine, in your work, and have quite a good understanding of how they think. Do you think we're far away from having uninsurable parts of New Zealand?
Well, we have got uninsurable properties in New Zealand. I mean, that's been in the news this year. People saying, "Look, I can't get insurance cover for my home anymore." So there are properties that are uninsurable, and let's see what happens. I mean, that's when RNZ quoted me in that article about us becoming a state of Australia. I mean, look, to be honest, that was a light-hearted comment right at the end of an interview, and I'm not a political economist or anything like that, but it would bring economies of scale to dealing with these issues. However, I don't think also that there's any evidence that Australia is any better at dealing with natural hazards than we are, and I don't believe they're any less resilient than we are to natural hazards either. But economies of scale is one thing, and yes, some parts of New Zealand are uninsurable. We know that it's been in the news this year.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, I guess, about individual properties, possibly suburbs or streets, maybe sides of streets,
yeah,
and then maybe suburbs, and then maybe it snowballs out of there. So I guess this is something that we do need to be thinking more about. And obviously we have EQC, which plays a pretty significant role already. But I mean, in time, do you see that private insurer sector remaining so vibrant in New Zealand or significant as it is now? Or do you think that, the state is going to have to play a bigger role over time?
Well, I mean, we're lucky we have EQC cover, I think, and that it is across a whole range of natural hazards, because not many countries have that kind of safety net. I mean, I know we do pay premiums. Those of us who are homeowners pay premiums into it, but not many countries have that safety net. I work with a guy in the Department of Commercial Law at the University of Auckland, and he's an insurance specialist, and he's very interested, and the group that he works with are very interested in development in the insurance industry after the events of this year to do with floods and storms. So I think, there might be some market corrections. Certainly premiums are going up. But I know insurance specialists are interested. The academic insurance specialists who work on this are interested in how things are going to go and evolve.
Yeah, and obviously we've got things like risk-based pricing, and I did a podcast recently with the CEO of Tower, and he was talking about introducing parametric insurance, which is a type of insurance contract that insures a policyholder against the occurrence of a specific event by paying a set amount based on the magnitude of the event as opposed to the magnitude of the losses in a traditional indemnity policy. So I guess there are some new types of insurance we're likely to see come in as well.
Yeah, parametric. I mean, that's quite unusual, I think. I think that was developed first in the US looking at flooding agriculture, didn't it? Well, that would be interesting here because I guess with your standard indemnity insurance, and I know this from colleagues who were affected this year, it can take a long time for all the loss adjusting and all the rest of it to occur. It's quite a long process. Whereas if it was just a parametric aimed at, a weather event that brings, say, 200 mils of rainfall in 24 hours or something like that, then I guess the payout can occur much more quickly, which for homeowners is really good. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of upheaval for people with the extreme weather events that we've experienced, and some tragic loss of life, lots of damage, to property, etc. I guess though, over the longer term, could some good come out of this year's storms, and if so, what do you think it would be?
I think good things are coming out of it already because obviously Grant Robertson's come up with the initial risk categories and definitions. People are talking a lot more about, hazards other than earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, because storms, do cause a lot, floods and landslides, and we seem to get them rather often, unfortunately. So people are talking about this, which I think is great. So, let's hope some good does come out of it. I mean, there's been a lot of affected people, a lot of red zoned houses, people financially crippled. So, let's hope, good things do come out of it because, obviously some people did die earlier this year in the events, and we want to avoid as much of that as possible in the future. So hopefully, there's a pathway forward, but I guess there's quite a lot of work to be done, and it's central government and local government, the sort of division of labour, I guess there, and the finances which are going to govern what happens.
Absolutely, yeah, and taking a long-term view, I guess, as well is important.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think so. Now, as I say, I don't think the 3-year parliamentary term in New Zealand really helps.
Do you think a 4-year term would make much difference, though? Because that seems to be the alternative option we talk about.
Well, look, it might do. It could do. But I think, we do have, a general issue, I think, where, politicians don't like making difficult decisions, it seems. And I say that not as a political scientist, but as a ratepayer and a taxpayer. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But it seems like there is movement from what Grant Robertson's been saying. But, it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the coming months, especially with the election coming up.
Absolutely. Well, look, thanks a lot for that, Martin. That's Martin Brook, Associate Professor of Applied Geology at the University of Auckland. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.